So now that you're familiar with the basics of JavaScript, it's time to take a small break and take a look at some other skills that you also need to develop in order to become a great JavaScript programmer. So in this section, you will learn how to actually learn to code, how to think as a developer, how to debug your code in case you run into problems, and also how to set up a professional development environment on your own computer. And we're going to start this section by configuring the VS Code editor to fit our needs a little bit better. And so that will then make coding a lot easier in the rest of the course. And once more, here on my desktop, I already have the starter files for this section. So go ahead and get yours from the GitHub repository as well, even though in this lecture we're not yet gonna need them really. But let's still open VS Code, because of course we're gonna need a VS Code window if we want to configure it. All right, now here on my desktop, of course I choose the developer skills folder, which is the folder for this section. And once again, we have an HTML file, which already has the script linked to it. And then here's also the script file, which has basically nothing. All I put here to get started is activating the strict mode. Because remember that from now on, we should use strict mode in all of the scripts. And so I left it here already so we don't forget it. But anyway, let's now start configuring VS Code, and we will start with a tool called Prettier. And Prettier is an opinionated code formatter, which means that it makes assumptions about how good code should look like. And so if we install it and use it, then this will make sure that your code is nicely formatted and also that it will look exactly the same as my code looks in the video. So that's going to make it easier for you to take this course. And also, of course, for you to write your own code in the future. So this tool is available as a VS Code extension. So let's click this extension button here. And then here all you have to do is to search Prettier. And it's going to be this first one. And I, of course, already have it installed. I just need to enable it. So I click here on Enable. But you will have to install it and then probably reload VS Code. So I enable it, and so now it is working. So install it on your end and reload the browser, and then come back here. Okay, so let's close the sidebar here again. And so installing this plugin was the first step. The second step is to now actually define Prettier as the default formatter of our code. So let's go here to Preferences, Settings, which should look something like this. And then here in the search bar, let's search for default formatter. So that's this one here you're looking for. And you see we have this huge list of available formatters. But the one that we are looking for is this esbnp.prettier VS Code. So this one should be here in case you successfully installed Prettier before. And so let's just click this here, and then we should be good to go. We just need to make sure that the format on save setting is also correctly set. So format on save. And we did this actually already at the beginning of the course. But in case you skipped that video for some reason, then just make sure that you actually tick this box here. All right. And so with that, Prettier should now actually be working. So let's just declare a variable down here and give it a couple of lines of space. And then simply x equal to something, and then give it a save. And you see that Prettier automatically did some changes to our code. So first of all, it removed all these blank lines that we had here. And it also transformed these single quotes into double quotes. Finally, it also added an empty line of code here at the end. Okay, so these may seem like small changes, but all of them added up throughout all the code can actually make a big difference. And again, prettier is an opinionated code formatter. So opinionated means that they have a strong opinion, and then basically when we use the tool, we have to accept that opinion. And many people don't like that, but actually I believe it's a good thing. It makes it so that I don't have to take a decision on how the code should look like. For example, some people prefer to write the if-else statement without a space here, and other people like to have a space here. And let's just write something here. And so now, no matter what we do, prettier will take that formatting decision away from us. So if I save this now, you see that it automatically inserted that space here, even if I don't like it. So if I remove it and save it again, it will be back. All right, but this makes it easier to make your code consistent and to make your code also consistent with other people's code. And in this case, my code that you can see here in the video. And so if we both use this tool, our code will look the same. Now, there are some things that we can configure. And for example, one thing that I don't like is the double quotes. I prefer to use the single quotes. But right now, prettier will transform every single quotes to double quotes. So I add single quotes, give it a save, and you see now they turned to double quotes. And so some things we can actually configure in prettier. So let me show that to you. So just Google prettier, and probably the first option here will be this tool. So here we can go to docs, and then probably here. So here we can do options. So configuring prettier and then options. And probably the web page looks a bit different by the time you're watching the video, but just search for the options here. So let's take a look at some of the things that we can change. For example, the width of one line, or if prettier should use tabs or spaces here, or if it should add semicolons or not. But what I'm interested here is the quotes. And so using this option, we can tell prettier to use single quotes instead of double quotes. And so that's what I want. Now, how do we actually configure prettier? Well, there are multiple ways, but the easiest one is to create a configuration file in the current project folder. So let's go back to the sidebar here. Then we create a new file, and this one is going to be called .prettier and then RC. Okay, and now here we basically write this object, and it's not really an object because this is not JavaScript code. And so now we write single quote. And actually VS Code already gives us this option here. And then as I hit enter, actually we get this preset value. But I actually want to change it to true. Okay, and if I now give this one a save, and then also save this, then you see that it automatically changed my double quotes back to single quotes. Great. Now, another thing that prettier does by default is something in arrow functions. So let me show that as well. And closing the sidebar here. So const, let's create a cog_h function again. Then we say birth year, and then we want to return 2037 minus the birth year. So just like we've been using. But now watch what happens when I give it a save. So you see that prettier actually wrapped this single parameter here in parentheses. However, I actually don't like this. So when there's just one parameter, I like to see it without the parentheses. And so that's another thing that we can configure here. And so that one's called arrow parents. And so now we can choose between always and, well, some other options. So let's just search that here with Command F, arrow parents. So we can choose between always and avoid. And so I want avoid here. Okay? And so you can take a look at this entire list here if you want. And then you can change your own configuration to match your preferred coding style. Okay, and probably by now you don't have yet really a coding style, but it's good to know that you can change stuff that you don't like or that you don't want to see. So for me, this is the two things that I always change, and as necessary, I keep adding more stuff from time to time. So let's close it, give it a save to see if this change is now reflected here. And yeah, so as I saved it again, the parentheses here were gone. And remember that we enabled format on save. And so that's why all these formattings take effect whenever we save a file. All right. Now, if for some reason you cannot make this work, then don't worry. You can still progress in the course without having Prettier working. That's because this tool does, of course, not influence how the code itself works. It's just a visual tool that only changes how the code looks. Anyway, this was already a big step on making coding a little bit easier for us. But now I want to show you something else, which is to basically automate something very boring that we're doing all the time. And that is writing console.log. So whenever we want to log something, we have to write all of this console.log and do all this work. But in VS Code, we can configure snippets which can take that work away from us. So let me show you how. So we go here in the menu into this preferences folder or submenu, and then here we can define user snippets. So click on that, and then you can open one of these files, but the best thing to do is to just create a new global snippets file. So click that and then just give it a name, and it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to call it Jonas here. And so here we can define a couple of snippets. And remember that the snippet that we want to define is simply one that automatically writes console.log for us. And actually there's already an example snippet down here, which basically does just that. So it's this here. And so let's just uncomment all of this. So again with command /. And so this here is the name of the snippet. Then here we say that it works in JavaScript and in TypeScript. This is the command that will basically trigger the snippet. And here I like to use CL. So whenever we write CL in the code, it will then expand that to console.log. Then here is the code that will actually be written. And here, get rid of this second line. And then here, also get rid of all of this. Because I found that this is the best way to make this work. And it's not really important that you understand how this works. This is just a recipe that I want you to follow here, just to make our lives coding a little bit easier. So then give it a save, and once you head back to your script, and now write CL, which remember is this prefix, but you could have chosen anything else. But in my case, whenever I write now CL and then hit enter, it will give me console.log. And then all I need to do is to go back and then write whatever I want to log here. Now here we can also define this $1, which is the way it was before, and then this will place the cursor between the parentheses. But then I found that when you do that, the autocomplete in VS Code does no longer work. And so that's why I don't use that. So you see now the cursor is here, but then autocomplete does not work. And in this case, you can't really see that. But if this variable name was a little bit longer, XYZ ABC, and then XYZ, so you see that the autocompletion is not working. I would have to go down and go up again, and only then it would work. Okay, and so let's just remove that and call it a day. Okay, so from now on, I will no longer manually type console.log. I will always just do this. Okay, and now to finish, let's just go maybe a little bit over my extensions that I have here, just to show you what I use. So let's remove that search text there. And so these first two are about HTML development, and I'm going to show them to you in the next section. Then these don't really matter. ESLint is a tool that we're gonna use later. Image preview is also good for HTML. Then Monokai Pro is the theme that I'm using, remember. Then of course Prettier. Then I have Settings Sync, which is very useful to synchronize settings between different VS Code installations. For example, if you have multiple computers or multiple accounts on your computer. And finally, one that I use all the time is to do highlight. So this allows me to highlight parts of a text. So for example, I can do something like this. So when I write bug in a comment, for example, then it gives me this nice red highlight. Or fix me is another one. So let me show you my settings here that will show how I do that. So that is preferences and settings. And then we need to go here into this icon. And again, by the time you're watching this, this might have changed. But what matters is that you need to open the settings in a JSON format. And so this shows all the settings that I have. And so here is how I defined these, these colored tags. So you need to install the to-do highlight extension. And then in your settings, you just write this kind of code to define different colored tags for different texts. Okay, so very useful one again. Yeah, I think that's enough for this video. This one was not really about coding or anything. It's just to set us up for the rest of the course, and also so that you start getting a feel for a little bit of the tooling that we have in the JavaScript ecosystem. All right, and actually in the next lecture, we will continue doing that. So I see you there in a second. Up until now, whenever we changed our code and then wanted to see the effect of the code in the browser, we saved the code and then manually reloaded the browser. But there is a much better way. So instead, we can make the page reload automatically whenever we change our code in the editor. So let's now learn how. So in the real world, no professional developer reloads their browsers manually like we have been doing. So everyone uses some kind of tool to do that. So to make our life easier as we go through this course, we will now also install such a development tool, which is called Live Server. And we can actually use Live Server in two different ways. First, we can install a VS Code extension, or second, we can use a bit of a more professional workflow using Node.js and a so-called npm package. And let's actually start with the easier approach, which is to simply install the Live Server extension here on VS Code. So that's Live Server, and it's this one here. So just click install as always. And then as we close this, you will see that down here we have this Go Live button, right? And so let's try to log something to the console here now. Or actually, let's try to click this button here first. So you see it says starting, and now it opened up a new browser tab on this address here. So this URL. Okay, then here we click on inspect just to open up the developer console. Let's increase it a little bit. And you see that right now we have no output here at all. And that's because we are not logging anything here in this script, right? And so now let's try to actually change the file. So let's just call the calc_h function here. And now watch what happens as I simply save this file now. So I hit Command S, and you see that here on the other side, the output automatically appeared without me having to reload the browser, right? And if I try some other value, give it a save again, then you see that it updated here again. And so that is the Live Server extension doing its work. Okay, but let's take it back here and actually close this window, because this was only the first way of using Live Server. So as I said before, there is like a more professional way of running live server, which is by using something called Node.js, which is a JavaScript runtime that we can install on our computers. Now, if the extension that we just installed works just fine for you and you don't want to add any more complexity, then you can just skip the rest of this video and move on in the course. But I will actually use the second approach in the rest of the course, which is to first install Node.js and then use an npm package called liveserver there. But again, you can follow the rest of the course just as well by simply using the extension that we just installed. You don't need to install Node.js and the liveserver npm package. But if you're curious and want to see how the second approach works, then let's now quickly go ahead and install Node.js on our computers. So just Google Node.js here, and then it's probably this first result that you saw here. And Node.js is a way of running JavaScript outside of the browser, but also it's a way of running development tools, just like the live server that we want to install now. So go here to Downloads, and then you can use the LTS version for whatever platform that you're using. So Windows, Mac, Linux, just download whatever you need for your use case, then install it, and then come back to this video. Now, if for some reason you cannot do this, or if anything goes wrong, then don't worry. You can, of course, continue this course without using liveserver. So please don't get stuck on this video if you don't manage to install liveserver for some reason. Okay? Now, anyway, after you successfully installed Node.js, it will become available as a program in the so-called terminal. And let's use the VS Code built-in terminal. So VS Code has a terminal included, and to open it, we need to go to the menu bar and then New Terminal. Or we can also use this weird shortcut here, but I prefer to do it like this. So let's increase this a little bit, and then I will clear this terminal here by hitting Command or Control K, and that looks a little bit better. I can also increase this by hitting Command plus, and actually that increases the whole window. So that I don't want. So let's go back. But anyway, in case you're not familiar with the terminal, it is basically a way of giving a computer instructions. And we will learn more about the terminal later in the course. This is not the point to worry about the terminal. All I want you to do is to write node -v. Then hit return or enter, and then you should see some kind of number here. It doesn't matter what number, but as long as you see a number, it means that you successfully installed Node.js. So if you have this number here, then you can now write npm install liveserver -g. And in case you're on a Mac, you will probably need to sudo this command. So start the command with sudo and then npm install liveserver g. So again, it's not important that you understand what this does. Let me just in 10 seconds tell you that npm is the Node Package Manager, which is basically a program to download tools. Then here we say install, and then here we say that the tool we want to install is called liveserver, and -g means that it should be installed globally. And that will make the liveserver tool available everywhere on your computer. So if you're on a Mac, use sudo here before the command, but on Windows you don't need sudo. And it won't work even if you use sudo. Then hit enter, and if you're on a Mac, you now need to enter your password. And don't worry if you don't see anything there. That is on purpose. Just write it anyway, hit return, and then it should start doing something. So right now it is being installed, and I get some errors here, apparently, but I think they are not really important. Anyway, I already had liveserver installed anyway, and so these errors here, they should be no problem. So we can clear our console again by hitting Command or Control key, like this. And so that looks much better. And now all we need to do is to write live server and then hit return. So try that. And it worked. So it automatically opened up a tab in the browser. So probably in your predefined browser. And this browser tab is now connected to your current project folder. And so in the console here, you can see the folder, which is this one. So developer skills in this case. And so that's exactly the project folder that we are in right now. So whenever you run live server in some folder, that folder will then be opened in the browser. And whenever we open a folder in the browser, it will then open the index.html file by default. And that's why we always have an index.html file in any folder. Okay, so let's open up the console here. Then we get a small error, but as we reload the page, this error will disappear. Yeah, that's right. And so here, let's actually get rid of this. And here, let's log to the console the result of calc h, and then with some year, just so that we can now test this. So when I give it a save, watch what happens here on the right side in the browser. So I will not reload the browser, I will only hit Command S to save this file. And you see, it took like half a second, then the browser reloaded, and now we get the result here automatically. Also, you can see down here in the terminal that a change was detected, and so that's what triggered the reload. So any file that changes in this folder now will trigger a reload. So even if I change something in the HTML file, for example, if I save now, then see how it changed here as well right away. So let's put that back, close it, and actually we can even close this terminal. So if I close it and save it again, you see it reloaded again very quickly, and it's still working. So the terminal, it's still down there, it's just not visible. But we can always get it back by hitting New Terminal. And actually that's a new one, but then just click this menu here and go to the first one that we had, which says Node. Okay, and with this, we established a real-world web development environment or workflow. And so now you can really start to feel like a real JavaScript developer, not one of the kind that has to manually reload their browser. So I hope that you find this as cool as I do. But in any way, we are now finished setting up our browser and also our development workflow. So basically, this part here of the section, so the editor setup. And so now we're ready to go a little bit into developer skills, because that's also an area that's important to develop for you as a new developer. And so the next couple of videos will be how to learn and how to solve problems. Now that you have a solid foundation of JavaScript, I want to talk a little bit about the actual process of learning how to code and give you some motivation. I think this is an important aspect of a course like this, but everyone else simply seems to overlook this topic for some reason. So let me share my advice on how you should learn to code as a complete beginner in this video. And to make this a bit more fun, I will start by telling you how to fail at learning how to code. And to do that, meet John. So John has been learning how to code for some time now, but he is failing miserably. He's just not going anywhere. I guess he is just not receiving the right advice. So let's see what John is doing wrong so that you can learn from his mistakes and learn how to code in no time. So the first mistake that John made was that he didn't have a clear goal at the beginning of his learning journey. He simply started by watching some courses and reading some tutorials, but he would just blindly copy the code without caring how it works. Even worse, sometimes he would just copy and paste code from tutorials or sites like Stack Overflow. While learning, he didn't reinforce what he was learning in the courses and tutorials by doing small challenges or taking notes. He also didn't practice coding outside of the courses, and he didn't come up with his own project ideas to improve his skills. Then, whenever he did code a bit, John would quickly become frustrated whenever his code was not perfectly clean or efficient. John also lost motivation pretty quickly because he thought he could never know enough. He could never know all there is to know. And this is a really big mistake. Also, he was just always learning in isolation without sharing his process. Finally, after finishing a couple of courses, he thought he was now a web developer and could start applying to jobs. But no one would take him because recruiters soon found out that he couldn't even build a simple app on his own. So that's a long list of mistakes, but it's not too late for John. We can fix all these mistakes, right? So let me show you how. So the first mistake is relatively easy to fix. What you need to do is to set a goal for yourself. Think about this and actually write it down on a paper or something. Make this goal specific, measurable, realistic, and time-based. For example, your goal might be, I want to become a front-end web developer within 1 year. From there, you can then develop a plan on how to get there. It also helps to know exactly why you are learning to code. For example, are you trying to switch careers? Or do you want to find a better job? Or are you just starting a new hobby? Whatever it is, it's important to be aware of the reason why you're doing this, because this will help you stay motivated when learning becomes more and more difficult. To stay motivated, it's also great to imagine a big project that you want to be able to build by the end of your learning journey. This has always helped me tremendously. With this project in mind, you just need to research the technologies that you need to learn, and then learn them one by one, step by step, in a calm way. Next up, instead of simply copying code from a course or tutorial, always make sure that you really understand the code that you're learning and typing into your editor. Don't move on if you don't understand. Also, always actually type code. Don't just copy and paste it from a tutorial or a site like Stack Overflow. This way, you're training your brain to remember the syntax later. Reinforcing is one of the most important learning techniques. It means that after you learn something new, like a new JavaScript feature or concept, you use it immediately to make it really stick in your brain. You can do this by taking notes and by challenging yourself with small coding exercises and challenges. For example, let's say you just watched the lecture about functions. So now you know what functions are and you saw some examples. But now, as a next step, you need to reinforce this knowledge by writing a function for your own personal environment. For example, you might need to calculate the average of your university grades, or you might need to convert recipe ingredients from ounces to grams while cooking. So just write a function that does this task for you and have some fun with it. Coming up with your own ideas like this and solving them will absolutely boost your confidence in your programming skills. And really take your time with this. There's absolutely no need to complete any course as fast as possible. Alright? Now, it's absolutely normal that in the beginning, it's hard to come up with your own challenges. That's why I included countless coding challenges in this course for you. You can also use a special challenge platform like codewars.com, where you can find thousands of coding challenges for different skill levels for free. I have actually solved some of Code Wars challenges in real life with some students, and I can tell you it's a ton of fun and really helpful. One of John's biggest mistakes was to not practice coding outside of the course environment. But practicing on your own is the single most important thing that you have to do. And I can't stress this enough, okay? Coding your own projects without any course guiding you is really not optional. If you just follow courses and don't code on your own, you will never ever be able to write programs on your own. So come up with your own project ideas, no matter how small or big, and just build them. Or you can copy parts of popular sites or applications. No matter what you do, really challenge yourself, make it difficult, and grow by overcoming obstacles. And I know it's scary to leave the comfortable environment of a course where you just have to follow the teacher, because you will fail and you will make mistakes and it will be difficult to code on your own. But getting out of our comfort zone is the only way we grow. So don't be stuck in tutorial hell, which is exactly the state of not being able to leave tutorials. And there is more about this whole journey at the end of this lecture. Now, when you practice, you should never become frustrated with the quality of your code. Do not get stuck by trying to write a perfect code, which is really clean or really efficient. So none of that matters in the beginning. You're still learning, so just write as much code as you can, no matter the quality. Really, clean and efficient code will come with time. Alright? It's just natural progress. Also, you can always come back and refactor and improve code later if you want to. Another important piece of advice I can give you, and I actually give it to myself from time to time, is to embrace the fact that you will never know everything there is to know in web development. Web development is this huge field, and so it's completely normal and acceptable that you will never know everything about web development. So don't put too much weight on your shoulders and create too many expectations. So in fact, the best developers and teachers have no problem in admitting that they do not know everything. Like the legendary Kyle Simpson, who admits that even after 20 years, it's still a struggle to make his code work and understand it the next day. So do not lose motivation if you feel the same way. Also, do not compare yourself to top developers who do know a lot more than you. Because of course they do. Many of them have been at this for over 10 years, or maybe even 20 years. But nobody was born an expert. And even experts are still learning all the time. Now, here it's actually pretty important that you have a well-defined goal for yourself. Because if you do, you can just focus on what you need to learn in order to achieve that goal. Everything else is unnecessary. It's just noise. For example, if you don't need a backend in your app, then you don't need to learn Node.js or PHP. Okay? The next mistake that is hopefully easy to fix is to not learn in isolation. One great way to do that is to learn together with other people, no matter if in person or online. Whenever you learn something new, explain it to them, because explaining things forces you to really understand them first, and repeating a concept will then really make it stick in your brain. That's why many people say that the best way of learning is to teach, and I actually share that opinion too. Another great technique that many people like is to share your goals publicly, for example on a social network, to make yourself accountable. You can also share your progress on social media to motivate yourself and others. For example, on Twitter, there are some popular hashtags that people use, like hashtag 100 days of code, hashtag code newbie, and hashtag webdev. If you use these, you will get feedback and a boost of motivation from other people that are on the same journey of learning to code. It's a really nice and friendly community, at least on Twitter, which is what I know and use. So for sure, you should try it out. And finally, the absolute biggest mistake that John made was that after he went through a couple of web development courses, he thought that he was now a web developer ready to take a job. Now, this is probably the biggest misconception that people have. Just take a couple of courses and you're done. But no, that is just not how it works. So I'm sorry to bring you the bad news, but courses like this one can only take you so far. They will give you an amazing foundation, of course, but they are just the beginning of your journey. You need everything else that we just talked about in this lecture in order to become a successful web developer. So let's talk a little bit more about this and the journey of actually becoming a job-ready developer. So here is a very true graph that shows you how your confidence in your skills changes as you become more and more competent as a web developer. And this is useful because it allows us to plan a strategy for your learning journey. So when you start, you are in the everything is awesome phase. You are studying one or more courses or tutorials, understanding how the code works, and taking a lot of challenges, just like I mentioned earlier. Now, you're not really competent yet, but are starting to get confident and are pumped to keep going. So this is probably where you are right now and will be throughout this course or any other course that you take. But then, as you start practicing on your own, you reach the cliff of confusion. Here you realize that coding might be a lot harder than you thought when you no longer can just follow a course with a predefined path. So your confidence is gonna start to drop a little bit, and you might realize you can't build anything meaningful on your own yet. But don't lose motivation here. Just keep writing lots and lots of code on your own, no matter how much time you need to spend fixing bugs and searching for a solution. It's all part of the journey, and it's still gonna be fun. Slowly, you will become better at writing code, so you will become more competent. But your confidence might drop even further because now you start to realize just how much more you will need to practice until you can build a real application on your own. You are now in the so-called pit of despair, but believe me, it's not as bad as it sounds. You might start to feel lost, but a great solution for this is to start learning with other people, like other beginners or even other developers who might mentor and help you along the way. To leave the pit of despair, you must keep challenging yourself. You cannot stop here, okay? So keep building bigger and bigger projects, run into lots of problems, and keep fixing them. You really need to have this mindset of fixing problems in order to become a web developer. It's what we do all day long, basically. At this point, it's also important to keep in mind that learning how to code is a really hard thing to do. So don't beat yourself up for finding it too difficult and for being stuck all the time. It is difficult indeed, but it's gonna be worth it. And trust me, we've all been in that place. And everyone who successfully works in the industry today just started out the same as you right now. So really, congratulations for even starting this path. That's already a great achievement in itself. Now you just need to continue building stuff. If you want to know about me personally, I learned to code by starting projects that were actually way too difficult for me at the time, but that made them real challenges that made me grow tremendously. For example, I tried and failed to build a football simulation game with Visual Basic. Then I built a content management system in PHP with really bad quality code. But it worked, and I actually sold it to a client and made good money. I also accepted some client projects for websites that I didn't know how to deliver. But I figured it all out in the end, and it made me grow so much. And I'm sure that the same is gonna happen to you too. Anyway, back to the journey here. At a certain point, you will start to see the light. So at this point, you're getting quite good at writing code, and your confidence will finally start to grow again. You are now in the back to awesome phase. Now you can either start learning new technologies, or you can start rounding up your skill set with best coding practices and tools that you will need for jobs, for example, like version control, testing, task runners, etc. If your goal is to find a new job, you're probably starting to be ready to apply for jobs. You need many things for that, like a really good portfolio, but that is a topic for another day. Just be aware that even when you're working, you will never stop learning. So you are never really done learning how to code. Web development changes really fast, and so you will need to be constantly adapting to new technologies. All right, and that is basically the typical journey from start to job ready. Now, please don't be scared by what I just showed you. I'm telling you all these things not to scare you, but to prepare you, because I really want you to succeed on this path. And I want you to achieve real success, not like fake success. There are just too many people out there who will tell you that coding is easy and that you will magically become a web developer in 2 months if only you take their course. But this is simply not true. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that coding is easy. It's not easy. But with the right attitude and the guidelines I showed you in this lecture, you can totally do it. And I mean that, because I've seen it happening time and time again. So many people have learned how to code from complete scratch, switched careers, found better jobs, and improved their lives dramatically. And I mean many of my students, and also many other people that I know personally. It's real, and you can achieve the same thing. Just keep going, keep coding, and keep building. In this lecture, we're going to talk about solving problems. Solving problems is one of the most important things in programming. So if your goal is to become a great programmer, you need to learn how to deal with problems effectively. So in this video, I will show you how to think as a developer by solving problems using a simple 4-step framework. And let's use our friend John again. So after some time, John can code now. He is almost job ready at this point, but he still needs to work on his problem-solving skills. And in programming, when we say solving problems, we mean a real problem that needs a real solution. For example, in an array of GPS coordinates, find the 2 closest points. And this problem is not straightforward, right? There are a lot of steps involved in solving this. And so we need a way to effectively solve problems like this one, or even way more complex ones. So problem solving does not mean to fix coding mistakes or bugs, alright? Anyway, whenever John encounters a problem that he needs to solve, he usually just jumps at the problem without much thinking. He also implements his solutions in an unstructured way without much of a logical approach. This makes him stressed out when things don't work right away. Another problem that John has is that he is too proud to research when he doesn't know how to come up with his own solution. So all of this is not effective at all. It makes John waste a lot of time. Now the first fix to this is to always stay calm and slow down and not just jump at a solution without having a plan. Also, when solving problems, you need to be in a mindset of taking a logical and rational approach. After all, programming is just logic, alright? Then, when you are in the right mindset, just use my 4-step framework to solve the problem at hand. And the first step of the framework is to make sure that you 100% understand the problem. Step back and take a high-level look at the big picture. And the most important part of this step is to ask the right questions in order to get a clear picture of the whole problem. And the best way of understanding this is probably to look at an example together here. So let's say you are working at some company on some project, and then your project manager comes and tells you, we need a function that reverses whatever we pass into it. And that's all you know about the problem. But do you understand it 100%? Well, probably not, right? I know that I don't. So let's ask the right questions to get there. First, we can ask, what does whatever actually mean in this context? So what should actually be reversed here? Well, and if we think about it, it only makes sense to reverse strings, numbers, and arrays. Objects don't have a well-defined order, so we can't reverse them. we're also not going to reverse like undefined or null or a boolean, right? Then, after we have that figured out, we can ask, what should we do if something else is passed in that is not a string, number, or array? How are we going to handle that? It's also relevant to ask, what exactly should be returned from the function? For example, should it always be a string, or should the type be the same as was passed in? Well, in this case, probably we should always just return the exact same type that was passed in. Also, we can start to ask more solution-oriented questions, like how to recognize whether the argument is a number, a string, or an array, or how to actually reverse a number, a string, and an array. So these are just some of the questions that we can ask here. I'm sure there are more, but this should already give us a way more clear picture of this problem. Now, right now, at the beginning of your journey, you will probably not yet know what the right questions actually are. But don't worry, this will come with time and practice, I promise. The next step is probably the most important one, which is the divide and conquer strategy. Divide and conquer means to break up the big problem into as many small problems as possible, because these small problems are then a lot easier to solve. And this also ties in with the previous step, because by dividing the problem into subproblems, you also take the big problem apart until you understand it exactly. So based on the previous step, if we wanted to break down this problem, we could define a couple of subproblems. First, we need to check if the argument is a number, a string, or an array. And this is, in fact, a small subproblem, right? So now we can just solve this one in isolation and then move on. The next subproblem is to implement reversing a number, then implement reversing a string, and then implement reversing an array, so that we are ready to deal whatever is passed into the function. Finally, we then also need, of course, to return the reversed value. So these are our subproblems, and they kind of look like a task list that we now need to go ahead and implement. And this is great, because it makes our work so much easier now. Now, sure, this example is a pretty simple problem, but this strategy works just as well for bigger and way more complex problems. In fact, divide and conquer is an essential method of problem solving that is also used a lot outside of programming. Anyway, with this, we have actually already covered the two most important steps of the framework. But now let's say that we actually do not know how to implement one of these subproblems. Well, in that case, we should not be afraid of doing as much research as we have to. Now, of course, we should always first try to implement a subproblem on our own using our own coding abilities. But if we're constantly hitting a wall and cannot move on, then we should waste no more time and just find out how it works using Google or a questions and answers website like Stack Overflow or the MDN JavaScript documentation. We will see how to use these in the next lecture when we're going to work together on a real problem. And actually, researching is a huge part of a programmer's job, as you will find out very soon. So you really should not be ashamed when you don't know enough to solve a certain problem. That's just completely normal. Now, in this case, some questions that we could Google are how to check if a value is a number or an array or a string in JavaScript. Or we could Google how to reverse a number or a string or an array in JavaScript. Okay? And again, we will do this in the next lecture on a real problem together. Finally, in case we are trying to solve bigger problems, we should put all the previous steps together and write some so-called pseudocode before writing the actual code. And pseudocode is simply an informal description of the actual code that we're going to write. So it's like code for humans to understand, not computers. For our example, the pseudocode might look something like this. So you see, we use some structures of a programming language, but this is clearly not JavaScript, right? And there are no real rules on how to write pseudocode either. You just write so that you understand it yourself or other people on your team. So in this example, we just start by naming the function as reverse, and then we basically pass in a value. Then we say that if the type of the value is not a string and not a number and also not an array, then simply return the value back. And that's because, as we defined previously, we only want this function to work for strings or for numbers or for arrays. And again, you can clearly see that this is not any valid JavaScript at all. But anyway, if the type of the value passed this initial test, then we say if the value is a string, then reverse the string. If the value is a number, then reverse the number. And if the value is an array, then simply reverse the array. And then at the end, we want to return the reversed value. Okay? So this is really more like a list of instructions that we now could go ahead and actually implement using the JavaScript language. Okay, and that's it. That's the 4 steps to solve any problem, no matter how big. And now, before I leave you, a final tip I can give you is to develop a genuine curiosity and passion for understanding how things actually work, not only in programming, but really in the whole world around you. For example, the famous scientist Richard Feynman was repairing radios when he was just a teenager, and Elon Musk made his first computer game when he was 12. And there are many more examples like this, and all of them became geniuses in their fields, in part because of their genuine curiosity on how the world around them works. Alright, and with that being said, let's now go ahead and solve a real problem in the next lecture using this framework that we just learned about. So see you there. Let's now solve together a real problem using the framework that we just learned about and also tools such as Google, Stack Overflow, and MDN. And here is our very simple problem. So let's say that we work for a company that builds a smart home thermometer. And our most recent task is this. So, given an array of temperatures of one day, calculate the temperature amplitude. And keep in mind that sometimes there might be a sensor error. And they give us this array of data. So, what should we do here? How do we solve this problem? And this is actually a pretty simple problem, but it still shows us the fundamental logic of solving problems. Again, using the framework that I just showed you before. And so the 2 most important parts of that is to understand the problem and to breaking up the problem into smaller sub-problems. So let's start by understanding the problem a little bit better by asking some questions. So first of all, they want us to calculate the temperature amplitude. But what actually is that? So we can write that down here. What is temperature amplitude? And the answer to that is that it's the difference between the highest and the lowest temperatures in the array. So answer, difference between highest and lowest temp. And so this is the value that we will have to return from the function. Then we might ask, well, that's quite nice, but how do we actually calculate the highest and the lowest temperature in an array? So let's write that question. So how to compute the max and min temperatures. And finally, they also tell us here that sometimes there might be a sensor error. So what does a sensor error look like? So what's a sensor error and what to do when one occurs? And here the answer is probably to just ignore the error. Now here from our data, we can actually see what an error looks like. So it's this string here, which says error, okay? But it's good to have an idea of all of these questions so that we now really understand the problem that we need to solve. And so I think with this here, we do have a pretty good idea. So now, given our understanding of the problem, let's try to break the problem up into smaller sub-problems. So first, we need to make it so that the sensor errors are actually ignored. So as I was saying, the answer to what to do here is to just ignore the sensor errors and simply work with the rest of the data. So how to ignore errors? Then another task is going to be find max value in temperature array. And then another task is to find the minimum value. And another task is going to be to subtract min from max and then return it. So subtracting min from max is of course the amplitude. And so that's what we need to return. And so all of these are simple steps, but it's good to have an idea of how we will solve this problem. And so that's why I wrote down every single step of the way here. So let's start writing a function. So although they don't tell us that we should write a function here, whenever we encounter a task like this, it's a good idea to write a function for it. So let's call this function calc temp amplitude. And so this function will receive an array of temperatures. So let's again just call that temps. And so now we are going to start to work on solving this problem. And let's start here with finding the maximum and the minimum value in this array. We can deal with the errors a little bit later. Now, probably we don't know yet how to do that based on what we just learned, right? I mean, we already have the tools for sure, but this requires a little bit of thinking. And if we don't know yet how to think about this kind of problems, it's a good idea to do some research. And so we will now use Google to research how we can find a maximum value in an array. And so that's what I meant when I said we should do some research and use Google whenever we need to. So what I like to do is to just write JavaScript and then be as descriptive as possible of what I want to achieve. So let's say get max value in array. And so don't be afraid to ask Google this kind of questions whenever you're stuck yourself. Now we get here a couple of replies, basically, but I'm interested in showing you Stack Overflow now. So Stack Overflow is a site of questions and answers, and most of the time someone already had the same question as we have. And so then they ask that question on Stack Overflow, and we can then go there and find a response. And this one here sounds good, right? Find the min-max elements of an array in JavaScript. So let's click on that one. But now here the problem is going to be that at this point, you will not understand most of the solutions. For example, this one here talks about prototypes. This one has like this weird apply and math. And so let's just scroll until one that we can better understand. This one has this weird dots that we will go into later. But here we actually have something that we can understand. So let's focus on this solution here. Okay. And usually the first solution is always the best one, or the first or the second. But in this case, we just scrolled a little bit more so that we can find a solution that we can implement with the tools that we already learned about. So what they're doing here is to start by defining the first element of the array as max. So in the beginning, they basically assume that the maximum value of the array is the first element. And then from here, they loop through the array or over the array. And in each iteration, here they test if the current value is greater than the maximum value. And if it is, then the new maximum here becomes the current element in the array. Okay, does that sound like a good idea? Well, I think that it does. So let's try to implement this ourselves, and then I will try to explain you a little bit better why this is a good solution. So let's create a for loop here. And of course, we don't need to copy the code here from this side. Usually it's best to understand the solutions and then trying to implement it on yourself. So not copying the code exactly from Stack Overflow. So let's start with the counter I. Let's start at 0 as always, even though here they're starting at 1. But never mind, we will just do it like we have always been doing it. So I must stay below the length of the array that we're looping over, and in this case, that's the temperature array, right? So temps dot length, and then I plus plus. Okay, and actually before we do the loop, we need to create that max variable that they have here. So let's do that. Let max equal the temps array, so the very first element. So again, we will start by assuming that the first element of the array is the maximum. And that's because we didn't loop over the array yet at this point. So this is similar to the challenge in the last section, where we started out with the sum set to 0. So that was a good starter value. And in this case, a good starting point is simply the first value of the array. And now let's implement that logic here. So if the current value of the array, so that's temps at position I, so the current position is greater than the current maximum value, then the maximum value will become this new value. And that makes sense, right? Because if the current value in the array is greater than the maximum, well, then that value should be the maximum, right? And so that's what we then do here. Okay, and now let's simply log it to the console. And remember that from now on, I will start using the snippet that we defined in the first lecture of the section. So I just type CL, hit return, and then max. Okay, and now just to test this function, let's call it with an array of just some values. So 3, 7, and 4. And so now it's very obvious what the result should be. And so I already saved it, and so probably we now already have the result here in the console, because remember, we still have the live server here running. And so it automatically reloaded the page, and we get the correct result here, which is that 7 is the max value. Let's add something else here, like 23. And now 23 will become the max value. And so the logic here works. So let's get rid of this one, and just to analyze what happens. So in the beginning, before we even start the loop, the max will be the first element of the array. So 3. Okay? Then the loop starts at the first position. So that's 3. So here, then we ask, is 3 greater than 3? No, it's not. So nothing happens. Then in the next iteration of the loop, we are at 7. So then the question is 7 greater than 3, which is the current maximum? And yes, it is. And so now max equals 7. Okay, next iteration of the loop, which is 4. And so the question is 4 greater than 7, which is the current maximum? No, it's not. And so nothing happens, and then we're done. And so the result in the end is that max is equal to 7. All right? Does that make sense? So we solved this problem here, so this sub-problem, where we found the max value. But now we need to do the same for the minimum. And hopefully you can see how that one works, because it's pretty much in the same way. So let's say min, and we will start at the same starting point here. And all we need to do now is to add another line to this loop. So we can do it all in one go. And so now what we're going to say is if the current temperature is less than the minimum, then that should become the new minimum. So min equals the current temperature. And actually, since we're using this here so many times, let's create a variable for that. So const current temperature is equal to temps at position I. And now I'm selecting and then Command D or Control D, 1, 2, 3, 4, and replace all of this with cur temp. Okay, and now just to see again if it works, let's log the minimum as well. And let's add some other value here. And so what can we expect when we save it? Well, the max should be 8 and the min should be 1. So I'm saving, and yes, that works. Next up, we can then tackle the problem of ignoring errors. So what that means is that we do not want to include this, right? Or in other words, this logic here should only run if we actually have a number here. Okay, so basically if the current element is a number, only then it makes sense to make this sort of comparisons. And so we can use something that we learned in the last section, which is the continue keyword. So let's say if the type of the current temperature, so type of current temperature is different from a number, then continue. And remember that continue means that the rest of the iteration will not be executed. So the current iteration will be finished and then it moves on right to the next one. And so in this case, what happens is as soon as the loop reaches this part here, since it's not a number, then none of the logic down here is executed, and then we move on to number 9 right away. Okay, so let's now actually call temp amplitude using our temperatures array. And indeed, we already have here the max and min temperatures. So let's confirm that that's correct. And yes, 7 is the max and -6 is the minimum. Awesome. So that works. Now there's only the easy part left, which is to return the amplitude. So return the max minus the min. Okay, let's get rid of this one here. And here, let's store that result into a variable, or actually amplitude. Okay, and then console log oh, actually there's an error here. This should be called amplitude. Okay, and so 23. So you can probably start to see that this is my favorite number, and so it comes up all the time here. Awesome. We did a great job here in solving this problem. And again, we did it because we first understood it correctly, and then we broke it up into these sub-problems. But now let's suppose that after we're done with our solution, the project manager tells us that the function should actually receive 2 arrays of temperatures and not just 1. But the rest of the function should work just the same. Okay, so, well, let's quickly write that problem down here. So problem 2, function should now receive 2 arrays of temperatures. So let's try to again understand the problem. So we can probably ask the question, when we have two arrays, do we need to implement the same functionality twice? And well, the answer is actually no. So the solution is to just merge the two arrays at the beginning. So just merge two arrays. And now we need to then again break this one up into sub-problems. And in this case, that's just, well, really just one sub-problem, which is how to merge two arrays. Okay, but we can see that this is probably the best thing to do, right? So imagine that we have this same function, but instead of receiving this one here, so just one array, it gets two. Then if we can merge these two arrays into one, then the rest of the logic could stay exactly the same. Okay, and here the problem should actually be just merge two arrays. So that is our sub-problem that we will now solve. So let's now do some more research here. So I think we could actually come up with our own solution here, but really I just want in this lecture to use the tools that we have to solve problems on our own with research. So I want to show you how a developer goes about doing these things. So JavaScript merge two arrays. So we have here the Mozilla developer network that I told you about in the last lecture. And here we also have, again, a Stack Overflow reply. So let's take a look at the Stack Overflow again. So here we see that apparently there is like a concat method. So here we can also see array.concat. So that seems to be the solution. And I remember that previously on that Google results page, there was also something about that. So this first here, so the MDN page is also about the concat method. So let's now actually explore the MDN website a little bit. Okay, and let's make this a bit wider so I can show you how it really looks like. And so MDN looks like this. And once more, it might have changed by the time you're watching this video, but the core functionality will still be there. So there's always a short description about the functionality and then some quick examples. Then here on the left side, we can actually see all the methods about the array. Okay, and that's because we are right now on the page about an array method. So concat is a method of arrays, so similar to push or shift or includes, right? So concat is just one more of these methods. And again, we can see all of the methods here. And as I told you, there are a lot of them. So push, for example, is the one that we already learned about and used. So we can quickly see that. And so indeed, the push method adds 0 or more elements to the end of an array and returns the new length of the array. So this is kind of what we did ourselves previously. And actually we can add multiple elements, which I didn't tell you by the time, but this here works just as well. But anyway, this was just to show you a familiar method. But let's return to concat here. So here is a long description of the method. Here is the exact syntax, which many times looks a bit intimidating. And so I like to actually stick to the examples here. So whenever you need to know how a certain built-in method or function works in JavaScript, you can always just look it up on MDN. This is really the complete but unofficial JavaScript documentation. And in fact, many of the things that I know about JavaScript come here from MDN. So don't be afraid of doing any research that you need on this page or also on Stack Overflow. Anyway, here from this example, we can understand kind of how the concat method works. So we have array 1 and 2, and then on array 1, we can call the concat method and as an argument pass in the second array. And the result will be array 3. And when we log that to the console, we will get A, B, C, D, E, F. And so that's the array 1, A, B, C, and then followed by array 2, essentially D, E, F. So I will just copy this syntax now and make this smaller again. And I will paste it here, just so we can then use it as a reference. Okay, and now I will get this whole function and not change that one, but instead create a new one. So calc temp amplitude new, and then here we also call the new one and call amplitude new. Okay, amplitude new. And now here we need to change the arguments. So remember that now this new function will receive 2 arrays of temperatures. So I'm just going to call them T1 and T2. Here at the beginning of the function is where we will solve our problem. So this subproblem of merging the 2 arrays. So let's again just put this here just so that we see it as a reference exactly where we need it. So what we want to do is to create a new array, and I will call it temps. And I'm calling it temps because that's the name of the complete array that we already have here in the function. So that used to be the name of the argument of the previous version of this function. And now I can just say the array 1, so array 1, which in our case is T1, dot, and then array number 2, which in our case is T2. And that's it. And now let's just log that to the console very quick. Temps, and we no longer need this. Okay. And here then we need to call this new function with 2 arrays. So let's just create 2 arrays. So 3, 5, and 1. And then another one, 9, 0, and 5. And now let's see. And here we see that it did actually work. So now we get this one array, which includes all the elements basically of these 2 arrays that we passed into calc temp amplitude new. So this function. And we can also see that 9 and 0 are the max and the min, and 9 minus 0 gives 9, which is then this new amplitude new. Awesome. So we solved this problem number 2 here successfully as well now. And yeah, so I hope that now you have a better idea of how to solve problems, and especially how to do research using the tools that I just showed you in this video. So that's Google, Stack Overflow, and also the MDN documentation. And this last one is, in my opinion, actually the most important one. I learned so much from MDN. It's incredible. So now in the future, whenever something is not working in your code, and even during the course, you can always try to figure out the solution on your own, for example, using Google or Stack Overflow. And so that will then be very helpful for your developer journey. So we talked about problem solving, which is a very important skill of any software developer. Now, another extremely important developer skill is debugging, which means to find and fix errors. So let's finish this section by talking about debugging to make you ready for the rest of the course ahead. So first of all, as you might already know, a software bug is a defect or a problem in a computer program. So basically, any unexpected or unintended behavior of a program is called a bug. And the actual term bug was coined in the 1940s when this real bug was causing an error in Harvard's computer. Now, there are many reasons for bugs in programs, but what matters here is that bugs are a completely normal part of software development, because we are humans and humans make mistakes. In fact, every complex application contains bugs, which sometimes go undiscovered for years and can cause security holes or other problems. So really, don't feel bad if you introduce bugs in your own code. We all do it, even the most expert programmers. Now, luckily, not all bugs cause huge security holes. In fact, many bugs are quite small and simple to discover. So let's see a simple example. Remember, in our previous example, the goal was to reverse whatever was passed into the function. So let's say we finished writing the reverse function and call it with this array and get this result. But clearly something is wrong here, right? The returned value looks like scrambled, but not reversed at all. So this means that we must have a bug somewhere in our reverse function. Okay? To fix this, we use a process called debugging, which is essentially finding, fixing, and then preventing bugs. So let's see how that works. So the first step is to actually become aware that there is some kind of bug. Because as I said, in a large application, bugs can actually go undiscovered for years. Now, discovering bugs usually happens during development, using automated testing software, or user reports during production. And bugs that are identified during production are the worst bugs, because it means that they went undiscovered during development and are now affecting real users of our application. So that's why it's really important to identify bugs early, for example, using automated tests. Now, while identifying the bug, sometimes we also need to take into consideration the context in which the bug happened. For example, certain bugs might only happen in a certain browser or only for certain users for some reason. Next, once we know there is a bug, we need to go into our code and find the bug. We need to isolate where exactly it's happening. And we can do that using the developer console that we already know. However, that only works for small bugs in simple code where we have a good idea where the bug might be located. But if the code is more complex and we have no idea where the bug might be, then we need to use a debugger software. And I will show you how that works in the next video, because it's really important for the developer to be able to use a debugger. Anyway, once we know where the bug is located, we can finally fix it. So we can correct the bug. And this is probably the easiest part. So essentially, all we need to do is to replace the existing, so the wrong solution, with a new correct solution that actually works. As a final step, we should then prevent this bug from ever happening again in our codebase. For example, we can search our project for the same bug in similar code, like in a similar function. It's totally possible that we did the same mistake twice in our code. And if that's the case, we must fix the bug everywhere. A more advanced way of preventing bugs is to write tests using testing software. And I might add a bonus section on testing to the course at some point, because this is actually an important part of software development. Okay, and that's it. That's a broad overview of debugging in programming. And we really just scratched the surface here, because you're still at the beginning of the journey. And so this is just an introduction. Anyway, let's now fix some bugs in the next video. Welcome back. So let's now put the debugging process actually into practice. And we're going to start really small and just fix a very simple bug using the console. So let's suppose that in our smart thermometer that we were working on before, we need to do some measurements in a unit called Kelvin, which is the absolute temperature. And the conversion to Kelvin is pretty easy. So all we have to do is to add 273 to the temperature in degrees Celsius. So let's very quickly create a function which will perform this measurement. And this is, of course, all completely fictional. And this function will actually take no arguments at all, because we will get the measurement from a command prompt. So we will basically pretend that the command prompt is like the thermometer sensor. And now let's actually create an object here. So an object for the measurement. So we haven't used objects in some time, and so let's remember that. And let's just set some arbitrary properties here. So the type of measurement is going to be temperature, and the unit will be in Celsius. So basically, we will measure temperature in Celsius, and then we return a converted version. And in there somewhere will be a bug. And now, finally, the value of this measurement will come, as I just mentioned, from a prompt. So let's just say degrees Celsius. And so that will then trigger a prompt. And then let's convert that to Kelvin. So as I said, all we need to do is to take the measurement in degrees Celsius and add 273. So that means measurement dot value. So this property here, where that value in degrees Celsius will be stored, plus 273. And now we can return converted value. And then let's run the function and immediately log the result to the console. So that's measure Kelvin. And now I will give it a save, and it will then ask me for the temperature. So let's say it's 10 degrees Celsius. And so now let's wait for the result in Kelvin. And we get this number, 10,273. And that is not what we expected. We wanted 283, but not this number. So there's got to be a bug somewhere. And so let's find it. And by the way, the first stage of the process was already this one. So A was to identify the bug. Remember? And now we're going to stage B, or stage 2, which is to find the bug. And so since the bug appears in the converted value, which is this one, and this one is derived from this measurement value, let's start by inspecting that measurement value in the console to see if something is wrong there. So console.log measurement.value, give it a save. Oh, and of course now we need to input it again. And so it looks okay actually, right? So it is 10, so that's exactly what we inputted. So it looks kind of normal. I just want to show something now to you, which is that we actually do have things beside console.log. So we also have console.warn and console.error. And with this, we can basically generate warnings and errors in the console. So 10 again, and you see that now this first one looks like a warning, and the second one actually looks like an error. So that's just a matter of formatting, but it's still interesting, I think. But let's take them out. And so, yeah, right now it looks like everything is correct. So let's dig a little bit deeper and take a look at the entire object. And actually, if it was myself, I would have done that immediately, but I want to show you the complete thought process here. So anyway, let's say measurement, so that's the entire object and not just the value. Let's turn off this one as well, give it a save, 10, and let's open up. And now we actually see the problem. You see, the value is a string. And that's because, as I told you in the last lecture, the prompt function here always returns a string. No matter what we input into that prompt window, it will always just be a string. And so that's why we get this end result here, because as you remember, the plus operator, when it sees a string, it will convert both operands to a string and then concatenate the strings. Just as another curiosity here, there is also another way of showing objects in a console, which is really handy sometimes. So measurement, and so again 10. And so console.table gives us this nicely formatted table. And especially for bigger objects, that can be quite helpful. And let's actually leave that here so that you can see it. So with this, we completed the second phase, and that was to find the bug. And now all we need to do is to fix the bug. So we need to do that right here where it actually occurs. Yeah, so up here. So let's see, fix. And so the solution to this is to convert this string that is returned to a number. So let's use the number function. So we already learned about this one in the last section. And so now we actually expect this to work. And indeed, now we get 283, which is exactly what we were looking for. Great. So this was a very simple example of just using the console in order to hunt down a bug and then fix it. But now let's take it to the next level and learn how to use a debugger in Google Chrome. And let me quickly show that to you with this current function. And for that, we actually need to make this a little bit bigger. And now we go here into sources. So for the first time, we're using the sources tab, and then click here on script.js, which is our current script. Okay, then as we move down, we have our code here. And now here in the debugger, which is basically these two panels here, we can set something called breakpoints. So let's put a breakpoint here in this line of code. So here, and we set a breakpoint by clicking here in this left bar. And so this will set this red point, which means that there is a breakpoint. And now when we reload the page, then the execution will stop exactly at this point. So basically execution will freeze in time and show us exactly what the execution looks like at that moment in time. And that includes all the values of all the defined variables. So let's do that. Let's reload. And so you see, now we are in this function. And now I can click this button here to resume the script execution. And it will then start going over all these lines. But now it can only continue if I input a value here. So that's coming from this prompt. So I put 10 here, hit enter. Then it does all of these lines here. And finally, we reach the line where I set the breakpoint. And so that's this one here marked in green now. And again, at this point, we can then see all the variables. So Kelvin is still undefined because the computation has not yet been done, but we can take a look at measurement here. So the value is 10 as we just inputted. And yeah, this can be very helpful in case that we don't want to mess around with a lot of console.logs or other stuff like that. We can also hover these here. So here we can see the whole object. Here we then can see just the property value. And now we can execute the rest of the function simply by hitting this step button here. So basically this will then go to the next line of code. So now we have Kelvin set at 283 because now the previous line just executed. And here we are in the last line. And so now we can see here return value will be 283. So with this one here, we can execute one line at a time. And for now, just ignore these three buttons here. You can explore them a little bit later. Okay, so we're almost done. Let's just click one more time. And so we're out of the function now. And now processing this next line of code. Let's just continue. And so now we went into some other stuff here, and that's actually coming from the live server. So never mind, we can just close this and now click here on resume script execution. and now we're done. So this is not all super intuitive, I would say. So just experiment around a little bit with these different buttons. Okay, now we just need to get rid of this breakpoint here, otherwise the execution will always stop here in the future. So just click this red dot here again, and then it's gone. And that's how we launch and use the debugger in Google Chrome. Now let's quickly introduce a bigger bug here in our code and then fix it using the debugger. And for that, I'm simply going to go back to this function that we created before. So this one here. And let's call this one here bug. So I will replace all the news with bug. So we have here cog, temp, amplitude, bug. And here we're calling that. And then we call the amplitude back, and here as well, bug. Cancel that one. And actually, let's come here and comment out this piece of code so that it doesn't annoy us all the time. And we can just set the value here manually to 10 now. Okay, this way we preserve the code that we have and also keep it running, or actually keep it working. So here let's just say using a debugger. Then down here we are calling this function, and here let's just change this to something else. Let's say 4. Okay, let's just run this now quickly. And so we see that the output at this point is still correct because we didn't introduce any bug yet. So the max is 9, the min is 1, and therefore the amplitude is 8. But now let's say that we did a mistake. And we might have thought intuitively that the max and min values would be good to have a starting point of 0. I think you can maybe see why that would make sense. So for example, we started the sum at 0 before. So why not start the max and the minimum at 0 too, right? It would have been quite reasonable to think that. And so let's pretend that we did think that, but this will actually introduce a bug because with this will not work. So as you see, now here it says that the minimum value is 0, right? So that's coming from this console.log here, which says now that minimum is 0 and that the amplitude therefore is 9 minus 0, which is 9. So we identified the bug here, okay? Let's again write that identify. And so let's now go back here to Chrome and to the debugger to try to find that bug. And the debugger is actually especially useful inside of a loop. And so that's the situation that we have right now. So we are in a loop. And so let's see here now why the maximum and minimum values are not being correctly set. Or actually it's just the minimum. The maximum is fine, but still we need to analyze both of them. So what I'm going to do here is to set a breakpoint right here, because that's where the maximum and the minimum are being computed. Okay, so let's reload, and right away we get to this point in the execution. So at this point, the temps variable has already been computed, so it's already this complete array. Max and min are at 0, and so now we are doing this. So we see that the current temperature is 3, that the maximum is 0, and so next step will end up here. Or let's actually continue. And indeed, now we see that max is 3. And that makes sense, right? According to the rules that we described earlier. Okay, moving on here. Oh, and we already moved on right to the next loop iteration. And that's because we don't have a breakpoint here. So let's just put another one. And so now we're in the second iteration. And so now I is 1, as you can see here. Okay. So the current temperature is 5, max is 3, and so now the new max should become 5. And yes. Oh, and again we jumped over this one, but let's just keep going. All right. So now the current temperature is 1, max is 5, and so this one will now not get executed. So now we can see this one. Current temperature is 1, which is less than 0, and so nothing is going to happen, right? And so here we actually have the bug itself. So we know intuitively that 1 here is supposed to be our lowest number. But the problem is that 0 is even lower, and so it's impossible for any of these numbers here to be set as the minimum. Again, because the initial value that we set is already lower than any of the values that we have in the array. And so now, by analyzing this one by one in the debugger, we can really understand that is what happens. So again, in this situation is where we would like for this 1 to be set at a minimum. But it's not going to happen because 1 is not less than 0 here. And so now there's not even a point to keep going. Well, we can still do that. So now the current temperature is 4, which is this one. And just one more. So I is 5. So we're in the last iteration. And we see that the maximum is already correct. And now here we can actually also see the loop finishing, because we see that temps.length is 6, and I right now is also 6. So 6 is not less than 6, of course, and so the loop will now finish. So you see, now we jumped over the loop and we are finally here in this next line of code. Let's go to the next one. And the value to return is 9, as we already know, because of our bug in the min. Okay, and that's it. Now we stepped over this entire function logic and saw exactly what happened line by line. And again, we're in the live server here. Let's just remove this and resume the script execution. Okay, great. So I hope that got you an idea of how we can use the debugger. Just wanted to tell you that instead of going through the sources tab here, we can actually also call the debugger right from our code. And all we have to do for that is to write debugger right here. So JavaScript has this debugger statement, and then when the browser sees this debugger, it will automatically open up the debugger tool. So when I give it a save now, you see that we are right at this point. So it's like it put a breakpoint here in this point, and then we can do everything as we just saw before. So let's click here on continue. Or actually, let's just get rid of this here, give it a save, or stop this and reload. And yeah, then we exited that debugger. Now, this was, of course, just a small example. But again, this is an extremely powerful tool that you can now use whenever you run into a problem in the future. So take a moment now to go through the steps again, maybe by yourself, and that will then help you make you a better developer, because debugging really is an intrinsic part of the development process. So I showed you some ideas and some tools to solve problems and to debug your applications. And so now it's your turn to put all of that into practice on your own. And so here is your coding challenge for this section. So given an array of forecasted maximum temperatures, the thermometer that we've been working about throughout this section should display a string with these forecasted temperatures. So for example, if we have this array, which is our first test data here, then the string that it will print should be this. So 3 dots, then 17 degrees Celsius in 1 days. So that's the 17 here. Then again, 3 dots, then 21 degrees Celsius in 2 days. So this 21 is this 21, and then 3 dots, 23 degrees in 3 days. So in 1, 2, and 3 days. And then again, 3 dots. Okay, and here you don't need to use this exact sign if you can't find it on your keyboard. I know it was a bit hard to find for me. So what you should do is to create a function called printForecast, which takes in an array called R, and then logs a string just like this one here to the console. Okay? And call this function for these two test values. And to solve this, you can use the problem-solving framework that we have just been talking about in this section. So try to understand the problem first by asking the right questions, and then break it into sub-problems. And I'm not saying that this is going to be easy. And for me, the main goal is not even that you achieve the result, but really that you start thinking about the problem and that you try as good as possible to break it up into sub-problems. And of course, there are many ways of asking the right questions and of breaking this up into sub-problems. So there's no hard ways of doing this stuff. So just try your best, take all the time that you need, and I will see you here once you're ready. Okay, so let me show you how I would have done it. And let's just close this terminal here, because remember that this live connection actually keeps running without the terminal opened. So let's just grab from up here this here. So as you see, I'm a little bit lazy. I don't like to type so much. So I just keep reusing stuff. So we need to understand the problem first. So let's look at that example string here. And so one part of the problem is definitely that this array here was basically broken up in 3 pieces, and then the separator is these 3 dots. Let's write that here. Array transformed to string separated by 3 dots. Then we can also ask what these numbers here are. So we already know that these here are of course coming from the array. But what is this? So 1 days, 2 days, and 3 days. So what is the X days? And the answer to that is that basically it is the current index of the array plus 1. So it would be weird to say that 17 degrees in 0 days, because this is a forecast. And so this is for the next day, and then in 2 days, and in 3 days. So answer index plus 1. Okay, so I think we understood the problem now, because I think that it's quite simple in this case. So let's now break this up into sub-problems. And I would say that the main problem here will be to transform this array into a string. Because that's essentially what we will have to do. Also, each of these elements here will be transformed to a string with these degrees Celsius. So let's just transform each element to string the Celsius. And I don't even remember where this is, so I'm just copying it here. Then we also need to account for the current day. So string needs to contain day. And again, that is the index plus 1. And finally, we also need to add the 3 dots between elements and start and end of string. So that looks like a lot of work, but actually it is not as hard as it looks from here. So let's start by creating 2 arrays here. So for test data 1 and 2, actually grab all of this in one go. Data 2. All right. And now let's tackle these problems here. Okay. So if the string would always have the same length, so if it would always just be 3 days, then it would be very simple. we could just basically hard code the string, right? We could just do something like data1 at position 0, and then the degrees Celsius, then dot, 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 and so on and so forth, right? So here I'm missing these, of course. So we could do this, and there's still some value in first actually trying to write this. So this is how it would look like. Data 0 and 1 and 2. And let's indeed log this to the console. Give it a save. And so actually already the string looks exactly what we had here, right? But of course, this is not the way to go. Because then here in data 2, we have a longer array. And we want to write one function that works for all the arrays. So that print forecast. And so of course we need a more dynamic way of creating this string. But still, as I said, there is some value in having done that because it will help us figure out how we can arrive at a solution. So print forecast is a function which takes in an array R. And now let's see what we have to do. So if we have an array and we have to do multiple operations on it, we will, as always, use a loop. So let's start with that baseline. So let I equal 0. And this part is now always the same. So I less than R dot length and I plus plus. Okay, but now what are we going to do? So how will we basically transform the array into a string? And there are so many ways in which we could achieve this, and actually in which we could solve this whole problem here, especially if you did some research to arrive at the solution here. But I will just go with a solution using the tools that we already used. So remember what we did when we calculated the average of a number. We started by adding all the values of the array using a loop, right? And we kept adding them to an accumulator variable that was called sum, right? So just to illustrate, that sum started at 0, and let's say we had an array of 2, 3, 4. And so in the first iteration, that sum was then updated to 2. Then in the second iteration, it was updated to 2 plus 3 equals 5. And then in the last iteration, it was updated to 5, which was the current sum, plus 4 equal 9. And so that's how we end up with the sum of all of these values. And now with the string, we can actually do the exact same thing. So here we will also have an accumulator variable essentially, which is going to be called string. So let's string, and instead of starting with 0, we will start with the equivalent of 0, but for strings, which is the empty string. So empty string has nothing. And then in each iteration, we will simply add to that string the current value of the array. So let's do that. String equals the current value of string plus array at the current position. And also let's already add this symbol here. And for that, let's wrap this here into a template literal. And so I'm selecting this, and then I can just hit the template literal, the backtick once, and it will wrap all of that. So then this, and then the degrees Celsius. And now all we need to do is to log that string to the console. So just as was asked, which takes and logs the string to the console. So we could have added that actually as one sub-problem, even though it's a really, really small one. Log string to console. And so let's give it a try now. I'm saving. And nothing happened. Oh, that's because we didn't call the function. So let's print forecast with data1. And here we go. So 17 degrees, 21 degrees, 23 degrees. And that already starts looking like what we have here. So essentially, we already completed the most difficult part, so of transforming the array into a string. And again, this was similar to adding multiple numbers into one bigger number. Here what we did was to add multiple strings to a bigger string that kept growing after each iteration. And if you want to make sure to really understand this, then you can always use the debugger and go through this loop step by step and see this string variable here growing as the loop goes on and on. So we already did this part also, and this part. Now let's tackle this one. So it needs to also contain the day. So what does that look like? So 23 degrees in 3 days. So in 1 day, 2 days, and 3 days. So that's not too hard. So in, and now we already understood that this had to be the current index plus 1. So the current index is I plus 1. So in 1 days. So in the first iteration, it's going to be 0 plus 1, then 1 plus 1, and then 2 plus 1. Give it a save. And that's starting to look really close to what we need in the end. But now we are missing the separator dots. So how do you think we can achieve those? Well, in fact, these dots are simply something that repeat after each of these strings here, right? So we have this value and then dot, dot, dot. So we have the value dot, dot, dot. We just need one more space here to create this nice separation that we have. And so now we're almost done. Okay. So actually this is not correct here because it's missing the in 1 day, in 2 days, and so on and so forth. But let's just compare it here with the original. And so all that is left is these 3 dots at the beginning. And so we can just add them at the end. So we cannot put them here, right? Because then we would have too many dots. So that's a lot of dots, and that's not what we were looking for. So instead, we keep it like this, and then as we log it to the console, we simply add the dots here at the beginning. So dot, 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 plus the string, give it a save, and yes, that's the solution of our problem. Great. We can just improve this here a little bit again by using the plus equal operator, and then get rid of this part, make it a little bit more short and more efficient maybe. And so, yeah, that's it. That's the result of this coding challenge. And again, you could have done it in so many different ways, but what I really wanted you to achieve was to understand the problem and to break it up into small subproblems. If you did that, well, then my goal with this whole section, I would say, is achieved. So, hope you liked this one, even though it was a little bit more theoretical, but I think it's important to also have a section like this in a big web development course, because soft skills like the ones that I just showed you are also very, very important for your success. In order to follow the project in the next section, and also the other projects in this course, it's going to be very helpful to be familiar with the basics of HTML and CSS. And so that's what this section is all about. It's a very simple crash course in HTML and CSS just to get you started with these technologies. Now, if you already know HTML and CSS, then please just skip this section. But if not, then let's now move on. So before we start this basic HTML and CSS crash course, let me tell you again that you should only take this if you have no knowledge about HTML and CSS at all. So if you do, then just move on to the next section. But for the rest of us, let's now get started and learn a little bit about HTML structure and elements. And let's start by creating a new project folder here on the desktop, which I'm just going to call HTML CSS. And in this section, we're actually not even going to have any starter files. So we're just going to create everything from scratch. Okay, so let's go back to VS Code and open this newly created folder. And here we go. So let's open up, or actually let's create an index.html file. And index.html is always the name of the main file in any project. Okay, let's hide this sidebar here. And I'm going to use Command B for that, or Control B on Windows. All right. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. And we use it to describe the content of web pages, basically. And an HTML document is made out of elements, and we write elements using an opening and a closing tag. The main element in all HTML documents is always the HTML element. So we write HTML, and then VS Code automatically gives us the closing tag. So you see the closing tag has just the same name as the opening tag, but then it has this slash here to close it. Okay, so every HTML document always has to start with the HTML opening tag and then close with the HTML closing tag. Then inside the HTML element, we always have the head and the body. So let's write that. Head and body. So this is always the structure that we use in HTML. Now, whatever we put into this head here is basically like the settings of the page. So it's like describing the page. For example, with the title. So for that, we use the title element. And let's call this one Learning HTML and CSS. And then once again, VS Code automatically gives us the closing tag here. So this title here is what's going to be visible in Google Chrome. So basically this title of the page right here. Okay, and you will see that in a second. Other things that we put here in this head, which is again like the settings of the page, is CSS styles or fav icons. So that little icon that appears here in browser tabs and stuff like that. Then whatever we put into the body is what's actually going to be visible on the page. And let's start by adding a heading here. And for that, we use the H1 element. And this is a level 1 heading. Okay, so you have H1, H2, all the way to H6. And they will have different styles automatically applied by the browser. Anyway, let's now give it here a title. And let's say, JavaScript is fun, but so is HTML and CSS. So just like before, we put the actual content here between two tags. So the opening tag, which is H1, and then the closing tag, which is this slash H1 to close the element. And different types of elements have different purposes. For example, H1 is to describe a heading, but we have other ones. For example, we have the P element to describe a paragraph. So let me show that as well. So let's write a little bit longer text here. So you can learn JavaScript without HTML and CSS, but for DOM manipulation, it's useful to have some basic ideas of HTML and CSS. And of course, the text here doesn't really matter. It's just so that we have some content on the actual page. And speaking of the page, let's now actually preview it here in Google Chrome. And for that, let's use the live server tool that we installed in the previous section. So for that, I'm going to use the integrated terminal by hitting Control \, Okay, so again, this very weird shortcut, or I can also do it from the menu. So that's going to be new terminal down here. Okay, then I can clear the terminal from all this weird stuff with Command or Control K. And so now it's a bit cleaner. Again, it's not important at this point that you really understand everything about the terminal. We will learn really a lot about it kind of by the end of the course. For now, all we want to do is to use the live server, just like we did in the previous section. So when we hit enter on this, this should now open up the page in this Chrome window here. And indeed, here we go. And you can already see that the browser applied some basic formatting based on the type of element. So this H1 here is way bigger and bolder than the main text down here, which is this paragraph, right? And let's add another paragraph here so we can see it appear on the page as well. So P again, just another paragraph. So when I save this now, the result should automatically appear here on the right side. And here we go. And again, as I told you in the previous section, if this live server is not working for you, then that's no problem at all. You can always just open the HTML document itself. Anyway, let's take a look at another heading here. So as I was saying, there is not just H1, but also other type of headings. So let's simply put one here. So let's say an H2, another heading. And so as you see, this one here is a bit smaller than this one. And if I would change it to an H6, and you see automatically it changed the 6 here, and that's because of an extension that I have. I'm not sure if I showed it to you in the last section. So that extension is called the auto rename tag. And the one that automatically closes a tag that I open is this auto close tag extension up here. So these two extensions that I have here, they are very useful for writing HTML. Okay. And here you already saw this reloading. And so you see that H6 is actually even smaller than the paragraph text. Okay. So you see that these elements, which are composed of an opening and a closing tag, are really used to describe content in this way. Now, of course, we can do a lot more than just headings and paragraphs. For example, links or images. But for that, we need to learn about attributes. And we're going to do that in the next video. Now, just to finish this lecture, I wanted to show you that we can actually create this bare bones structure of HTML in a very easy way in VS Code. All we have to do is basically type exclamation mark and then tab, and like magic, all of this appears. So we still have the HTML tag, and then in there we have the head and the body just like we had before. The difference is that we also got this doc type here, which essentially identifies this document as being HTML5, and we also get this language here on HTML. So in this case, it's telling the browser that we're using the English language. Here is some other stuff that's also important, but that I'm not going to go into now. And then here is the title that we just specified also in our document up here. So now I will just go ahead and take this content and put it here in this structure because it's actually more complete. So just take this and cut it, put that here, delete all of this, give it a save, and let's put this one here back to H2. And here we go. Actually, we can close this one. And all right. So see you in the next lecture where we're going to talk a little bit about attributes and classes and IDs. Let's now learn about HTML attributes, classes, and IDs, and then also learn about a couple more different HTML elements. So what are attributes? Well, in HTML, some elements can have attributes. And these attributes basically describe elements. So let's, for example, create a link. And this link will be inside of this paragraph. Okay? So as you already saw, we can nest elements inside one another. for example, this h1 is inside the body, and this p element is also inside the body. So they are child elements of the body element. Okay, so I forgot to mention that in the last lecture. Anyway, so let's now add this link element inside of the paragraph. And for that, we use the anchor element. So it's an A. And then in here, we put a text that we want to be displayed on the page. So just like before in the paragraph, for example. So here I want to place a link to my profile on Udemy. So let's say Jonas on Udemy. But now, how do we tell the browser where this link should actually point to? And that's where the attributes come in. So as I said, we use attributes to describe elements. And in this case, we describe this anchor element using the href attributes. And so href stands for hypertext reference. And so here we put the URL where this link should point to. Okay, and so let's actually get my profile page on Udemy. So Jonas, Udemy, and that's actually the link, I think. Yes. So let's copy this and put it here. Okay, give it a save. And now, well, here we have to reload it. So sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes we have to reload. Okay, so when you don't see it changing right away, just reload and then it will work. So here we have this now blue link. And so that's the standard format of any HTML link. And when we now click this, indeed, it goes to my user page here on Udemy. And of course, you can use your own link or whatever link you want to use. Okay, and then we can go back and we're back on this page. Okay, so that's what we used this href attribute for. We described the anchor element by telling it which URL it should go to whenever we click on the link. Now here on the page, you can actually see that this text here, so this link, is right in line with the previous text, so the text here in this paragraph. That's why we call the anchor element an inline element. Okay, so it flows in line with the rest of the text. Now on the other hand, for example, this h2 element here is a so-called block element. Because as we see here, this heading is not in line with the text of the previous element. It created a new line which only contains this content of this heading, right? So all of this here is this huge block, and so it's a block element, not an inline element. Okay, so we can actually include this link here in a sentence. So let's say you can learn more about it. And then let's say on Udemy. Here we need a space. Okay, and so now this looks like a normal sentence and then with a link in it. And we can even put a period after it. Great, so let's check out another element which needs attributes, which is the image element. So let's do that after this. Some more space here. And for the image, we use the img tag and then the source attribute. And then in here, we can specify any image from the current working folder, or we can also set an image URL. So let's do that. So what I'm doing here is, since we're talking about HTML and CSS on this page, I want to copy this, this image here. Okay, so the image address. So I'm getting the image address here, and now I'm pasting it here. And so this JPEG image is now the source of this image. Okay? And now you see here that with the autosave, it added this closing slash. And that's because the image element does not have a closing tag. It only has an opening tag, which is img, of course, but then we don't have a closing tag. And so we can close this opening tab by the end, using this slash here at the end of the tag. But it's actually not mandatory. It works just the same without this one here. Okay? So image doesn't have a closing tag because we don't really put any like written content in here. It's not like we say now course image or something and then close the image, right? That would make no sense. And so that's why images don't need the closing tag. Now, if we check it, indeed, here now is the image. Okay, so that's the source attribute. And as you see, different elements have different attributes. So for example, the href attribute is not going to do anything on an image. And the opposite is true for the source attribute. So if we use source here on the anchor element, it's not going to have any effect. And so when you really learn HTML properly, you will then learn exactly which attributes you can use on which elements. But it's actually pretty straightforward, and you get used to it pretty quick. Now, there are two very important attributes that we can actually use on all elements, and which we can use to identify them. And these are classes and IDs. So we use classes and IDs to essentially name elements so that we can then select them in CSS in order to style them. And actually, we also use IDs and classes to select elements from JavaScript when we do DOM manipulation. So classes and IDs are crucial to identifying elements, and especially classes. And here's how that works. And again, we can add them on any element. So let's add one here to this paragraph. So all we have to do is class, and let's call this one the first. Okay, because it's the first of these two paragraphs. And then here, class. Again, and you guessed it, this one is going to be called second. And we're going to use these in the next lecture to then select the two paragraphs and style them differently. So then according to these classes. Now, as I said, beside classes, we also have IDs, and they work like this. So let's add it here to the image. Let's call it course image, just like this. Now, the difference between classes and IDs is that IDs have to be unique. Okay, so each ID can only be used once on the page, while classes can be used over and over again. So I could have more paragraphs called second, but I could not have another element called course image. All right. In practice, we actually almost never use IDs to style elements or to select them from JavaScript. It's just a better practice to use classes. Okay, and now to finish, let's create an HTML form so that we can use some more attributes. Okay, so let's do that here after the image. And now I will also introduce you to the idea of basically creating boxes. So we want the contents of this form to be in a box. And so there are many ways of creating boxes in HTML. The most generic box is a div. So let's say div, and let's give it a name here using an ID again, just that so we use classes and IDs in different places so that you can learn how to use both. So I'm calling this box here your name because that's what we're going to do in this form. So just an input asking for the user's name, basically. Okay, and here it already closed the element for me. Oh, and maybe you're also noticing that for the names here, so the ID name, but also for class names, in CSS we use the dash to separate two different words. So in JavaScript we would use camel case, so course, and then like this, right? But the convention in CSS is to write it like this. Of course, it would also work the other way, but this is just a convention. Okay, and let's create just a heading for this form, your name here. Okay, and you can see that, of course, we can have multiple H2 elements here on the same page. So we have here a secondary heading and here another one. Okay, so we already have the H2 here now, and there's also this box around it, but you cannot really see it. But we will see it in the next lecture when we actually style all of these elements using CSS. Anyway, let's now add another paragraph here. Please fill in this form. And now let's actually use an input element. And so with that, we are then basically creating a form. So input. And then we use the type attribute to specify the type of data that should be inputted into this element. So once again, we're using an attribute to describe this element. So here we could use text, or as you can see here, we could use button, checkbox, email, file, and so on and so forth. But here we're just going to use text. And then we can even specify a placeholder. Now we'll just use the autocomplete functionality here. Okay. And we close it. And once more, this is one of the elements which does not have a closing tag. Because, well, again, it doesn't make much sense to have that here. And then usually a form also has a button. And so for that, we have the button element. And in this case, it actually makes sense to have content. And so that's why there is a closing tag, which VS Code automatically placed there for us. Let's give it a save. And here we go. Nice. So we have a nice input and a button. Now, of course, nothing will happen because for that, we would need some JavaScript. But that's not the point of this lecture or of this section. But now you know how to create a form like this. And now just to finish this form, we should actually change the name or the type of the element of this box here. Okay? Because this is now a form because it has this input and this button elements. And so in HTML, we have a special element for that, which is instead of div, we use form. Okay? Give it a save, and it looks exactly the same, but this is more semantic. What this means is that the form element better describes the content that is inside of the box than just the generic box that is the div. Okay? So the div element is really just a generic box which has no meaning at all. And so that's usually not a good idea for many reasons. For example, for SEO. When Google searches your page, it's better if it knows exactly what each element means than just having generic boxes without any meaning at all. Okay? So using the appropriate element according to the content that's in it is the idea of semantic HTML. In this case, we are creating a form here because we have an input and a button, and so we use the form element that HTML gives us just for this purpose. Okay? It looks exactly the same as a div element, but it has a meaning, and so it's semantic. Okay, and that's it for this video. In the next one, we're finally gonna style all this using some HTML. Let's now learn about the very basics of CSS and make our web page look a little bit nicer. So as you probably already know, we use CSS to style elements and to create a layout for the overall page. And we can write CSS right here in the HTML file using the style element. Okay, and that style element is not for visible content here on the page, and so it should go right here into the head. Okay, because remember, the head is basically like for settings of the page. And the style definitely counts as a setting. So style. And now to style elements, we need to first select them. And there are different types of selectors in CSS, and we're going to learn about a couple of them in this video and the next one. But the most basic one is the element selector. And with the element selector, we can simply select all elements of a certain type. For example, the body. So we write body and then curly braces. And then in here, we can write our CSS declarations. So each CSS declaration has a property name and then a value. For example, we can style the background color. So background color, and let me actually autocomplete it here. So background color is the property, and then let's say green. So in CSS, there are a couple of predefined color names, and we can then use these. Give it a save, and bam, our page is green now. So that's CSS for you. So we have the body element selector. Then all of this here is our declaration block. And this here is a simple declaration where background color is the property and green is the specified value. Now, usually we write our CSS in an external CSS file. So just like we write JavaScript in an external script, we do the same basically with CSS. So let's create that separate CSS file. So I'm bringing back the sidebar here using Command or Control B. And then let's call this one the style.css. Close the sidebar. And now we need to connect these two. So again, just like we had to connect the JavaScript file to the HTML, we also have to select the CSS. But it works a bit differently. So let's copy this here, or cut it here. So when I save it now, of course, it's gone, okay? And that's because the style file is not yet linked to the HTML. So we link it by using the link element. So that's not very creative. So here we use href again, which remember is the same attribute as in the anchor element here. Okay, but don't confuse anchor with link. So link does not create a clickable link, so like this. Instead, we use it only to basically link CSS files to HTML files. So here we say style.css because that's the name that we gave to the file. Okay, and then we also need to specify the rel attribute and set it to style sheet. Give it a save, and here we go. The green color is back. Okay, and so now we can write all our styles in the separate file here, and so we separated the presentation from the content. So let's actually make this like yellow, and we should probably give it a little bit a nicer color. And in VS Code, when you hover a color like this, you see this pop-up, which then allows you to select the color. And this is very handy. So let's do this, and then maybe just a very subtle color like this. All right, this looks a lot better already. Okay, so let's now explore some more CSS properties. For example, we can set the font family. And here we can start by setting it to a font that you probably have on your computer. And so Arial is probably one that you have. Now in practice, we use web fonts, for example, from a service like Google Fonts. Okay, but in this case, it doesn't really matter. So let's just give it a save. And so you now saw this font here changing. And on your system, that should work too. And if you don't have Arial, then just use some other fonts that you have available. But now you might ask, we set the font family on the body, right? So why did all these elements, like this H1 here and this P element and this H2 element, why did all of them get the Arial font as well? Well, that's because the font family property is a property that gets inherited, okay? So all the child elements of the body element will automatically get this font family assigned to them. And that makes it very handy so that we don't have to go ahead and set the font family separately on all these elements. So just setting this on the body will then set it on all the child elements. Now, most properties do actually not inherit, but generally all the properties that are related to fonts will inherit. So let's check out another one. Font size, and let's set it to 20 pixels. Give it a save, and you see that everything got a little bit bigger now. However, not all the elements have a font size of 20 pixels now. And that's because the elements like this H1 and this H2 have predefined font sizes that automatically are applied from the browser if we do not specify them on our own. Okay? But of course we can override them with our own selectors. So let's say H1, and so this is another element selector, and in this case, of course, it selects the H1 element. So let's say font size 50 pixels. And so take a look at this now, and well, that's huge. Let's make it a little bit smaller, maybe 40. Yeah, that looks about right. All right. And now let's actually use the class names and the IDs that we set in the previous lecture to now select elements based on these classes. So remember that here we set this paragraph to first and this one to second. So we basically named them like this. And in fact, let's go ahead and add another class here to this other paragraph. So class, and I will call this one first2. Okay, so remember, IDs have to be unique, so we can only use them once, but classes can be used multiple times. And so that's what we did here. And so now I can go ahead and select all the elements which have the first class, so this paragraph, and then style them however I want. And this will then only affect these two paragraphs, but not this one. Okay, because this one has the second class. So let me show that to you. And so the class selector is using the dot. So dot first. Okay, and so this is our selector. Dot is for the class, and then first is the class name. And so we set the text color using the color property. And let's set it to red, give it a save, and what do you think will happen now? That's right. This paragraph and this one, which are the two paragraphs which have the first class, are now red. But this other paragraph is of course not red because we didn't select it here. Okay, and so this CSS rule here does not apply to it. Finally, let's also format or form. So let's check that out. And so here we have this your name ID, right? So we already know how to select based on the class name. And so let's now learn how to select based on ID. And it's very similar, but instead of the dot, we use the hash. So hash your name, I think that was the ID, right? Yes, your name. So let's set a different background color here. And I will again use this trick where I can now set the color using this pop-up window. So that's a trick I like to use. Let's make it similar, but a little bit darker. Yes, that looks nice. And we will make it even nicer in the next lecture after we learn about the box model. But for now, this looks good already. So another one that we can use here is the border property. And the border property is a so-called shorthand property, because here we can set multiple values for just one property. So for the border, we can set the width, so basically the thickness of the border. So let's say 5 pixels. Then we can set the style of the border, and let's make it solid, but we could also make it dotted or dashed, but that would look a little bit like weird. And then the color. So until now, we have always used CSS color names or this RGB format like this. But of course, CSS also accepts RGB colors. So for that, we use the hash, and then let's use 444 as this dark gray. So you see this is a dark gray, but we could of course change it again using this pop-up. Okay, but let's leave it here with the RGB code, give it a save, and here you see this nice border around the form. Okay, so again, this border is a shorthand property because it allows us to specify multiple values here like this. You can also notice that this property is not inherited, right? So unlike the font family or the font size, because if it was inherited, then now all these child elements here would have a 5 pixel border around them as well, right? So this one and this one, but they do not. And well, in this case, it wouldn't make sense. And so that's why border is not inherited. Okay, and this should be enough for one lecture. In the next one, we will learn about the box model so that we can then add some spacing here. For example, some spacing here inside of this box to give it some space here and also some space between these elements. So stay tuned for that and see you in the next lecture. The box model is one of the most fundamental parts of CSS. That's because it's the main factor that defines how elements are displayed on a web page and also how they are sized. So according to the box model, each and every element on a web page can be seen as a rectangular box. And each box can have a width, a height, padding, margins, and a border. And we can specify all these using CSS properties. But note that they are all optional. So there can be boxes with no margins or no paddings or no border at all. Now this image here shows us how the box model works. And so let's break it down. First, the content of a box is where all the text, images, and other content that we specify goes. We can easily define its height and width using the corresponding CSS properties. Next, the padding is a transparent area around the content, but still inside of the box. And we use paddings to create white space inside of a box, and we can define the padding by specifying the padding property in CSS. Next, we can specify a border for any box, and that border then goes around the padding and the content. And this actually we already did in the last lecture, right? Then, similar to the padding, we have the margin. But instead of being inside the box, the margin is white space that's actually outside of the box itself. So we can think of margin as the space between boxes. So for instance, if we want to create some space between two elements, we will simply use their margin properties in CSS. And finally, there is something called the fill area. So remember how the text content and images go inside the content box? Well, the same does not apply for background images or the background color of a box. These properties will actually be applied not only to the content box, but to the entire fill area, which also includes the padding and the border, but not the margin. Okay? All right, so let's go back to our code and implement some of these properties. Now, if we take a look at our page here, we will see that actually there's already a lot of space here, right? For example, between this heading and this paragraph, and here is space, and here, and there's also a lot of space around this H2 element here, and that's because by default, some elements get some margin automatically if we don't define them, okay? Now that can create some problems when we're trying to style our page, and so usually what we do is that we reset all of the margins and all of the paddings on all elements before doing anything else. So this is called a global reset. And so to do that, we need to select all the elements. And for that, we have a special selector. And that is the star selector. Okay, so again, with this, we can select all the elements on the page. So what we do then is to set the margin to 0 pixels. And when we use 0, we don't even need to specify the unit. So just 0 like this. And the same for padding set to 0 as well. If I give it a save now, it looks like this. So all the paddings and all the margins are effectively gone. And that's exactly what we wanted. Now we also need to add another property here. I mean, we do not have to, but we usually always do, which is the box sizing property set to border box. Okay, now this will not change anything here, and I'm not going to go into detail what this does. I'm just putting it here so that you know that we always use it. Okay, so essentially what this does is that it will include paddings and borders into the width or the height that we specify for an element. So for example, if we specify the width of an element to 100 pixels and then add a padding of 20 pixels on each side, then 100 plus 20 plus 20 would be a total width of 140 pixels, which could create problems if all we wanted was a width of 100 pixels. And so to fix this, we use box sizing set to border box. And so in this case, if we specify the width to 100 pixels, it will always be 100 pixels no matter how much the padding. Okay? And if that doesn't make a lot of sense to you at this point, then you can always Google around how it works if you want to go into more detail. But since this is just a crash course, I'm not going to go into a lot more detail. So now what I want to do is to add back some margins and some paddings so that you can see how exactly they work. And let's actually add with the body, and here we will set some padding. Okay, and why do we use padding? Well, it's because we want to add some space inside of this body element. So basically to create some space between the border of the browser, so of this viewport, and the content. So let's set it to 75 pixels. And by the way, there are also other units in CSS. We don't always have to use pixels. We can use percentages or other more weird units like M or rem or points or anything like that. But to start out, it's easier to just understand with pixels. Okay, so give it a save. And so now you see that it added this nice space between the sides. Okay, it's maybe a bit too much. Let's put it back to like 50. Okay, and now let's move on and add some space between this heading here and this paragraph. And to do that, we can simply add some margin to the bottom of this H1. Okay, so we can specify paddings and margins like this. So as we did here, margin and padding, and that will then apply them to the 4 sides of the element. But we can also do that selectively to only the left side or the right side or the top side or the bottom side. And so let's now add margin to the bottom of H1. So margin and then bottom. And let's say 25 pixels, give it a save, and here we have, okay? Now, if we did padding here, it would actually look the exact same way. Let me show that to you. And indeed, it works the same way. But now this space is inside of the H1. Let me show that to you using the inspector. So this is the H1 and the green part is the padding. You can also see that here. So this is the content, and then we have 25 of padding. Then here you also have the border and then the margin outside of the border, so outside of the element. And essentially this is what we learned at the beginning of this video, right? But it makes more sense for this space actually to be outside of the element. And so a margin in this case makes more sense. And so you see that now this 25 is here painted in red, right? And so it's now outside of the element. Okay, so this element tab here in the developer tools is pretty useful to inspect so the styles of all the elements and also to check out the markup, so the HTML in here. We can turn on and off these different properties, and in general this is really helpful to work with HTML and CSS in the browser. Next up, we should probably also add some spacing after the H2 elements. So let's say margin bottom 20 pixels. Okay, and we can also do another thing that I didn't show you before, which is to set the text align property. So text align, and now we can set it to left, right, or center. And I want to set it to center here. And then, as you expect, the text will get centered here. So basically centered inside this whole box. So the H2 box, and again, we can see the box using the inspector. Okay, so the box itself is this whole blue space that we can see up there. And so the text of the H2 is then centered inside the H2 box. Okay, and remember that this is a block element. And so that's why it creates a box basically. So block elements are the elements that create their own line, and inline elements, remember, is like the link here. So if we inspect this one, you see that the box only occupies the space of the text itself, right? It doesn't create a whole box on a whole line. So that's the big difference between inline and block elements, all right? Okay, so this form here, of course, is also a block element. And so let's make it a little bit more narrow. And so as we learned by the beginning of the lecture, we can do that using the width property. So let's set it to 400 pixels. And that looks a lot nicer. Okay. Now we also want to create some space between all this content and the border. And so how do we do that? Well, that's right. We have to use padding, because padding creates space inside of the box. And yes, indeed it does. And now let's also create some space between the image and this form here. Okay. And so here we can add some margin to the top. So margin top, and let's say, well, 50 pixels. Might be a bit too much. Yeah, let's just set it to 30 so we can see it. And now let me actually just show you what happens if we take out this property here. Okay, so we can comment it out just like we comment out code in JavaScript. So let's hit command slash. And so you see in CSS, the commands are like this. So slash star star slash and not slash slash. Okay. And so as I save now, take a close look here at this form. And you see that it now get wider. So let's inspect it here. So the form, we need to select the form here and then scroll down. And so now you see what I explained earlier. So we defined the width as 400, but then we have a padding of 25 here, right? And so that then gets added to the total width of the element. So we have 400 plus 25 here plus 25 here, and then also 5 pixels border on each side. So 5 here and 5 here. And so that makes it then that the whole element adds up to 460 pixels, I would guess. So you can see that here on the screen. So up here, that it says that the width is actually 460. Okay. And so again, that's because it adds up all the borders and the paddings to the width. And that's what happens without box sizing to border box. But if I put it back on, so again, command slash, if I save it now we are back to what we expected. So 400. So we set it here to 400. And so we wanted it to be exactly 400 and not for all the other stuff to be added. And so now, as you see here, it says 400. And so automatically CSS then changed the width of the content here to just 340 to accommodate the rest of the width, basically, that's needed for the padding and the border. Okay, so I said I wouldn't go into a lot of detail, but I guess I just did anyway. But anyway, let's now also add some margin to these paragraphs here. So I used the first class to select this paragraph and this paragraph. But now we want to select all 3 paragraphs. And so for that, we can simply use the P selector. And that will then select all of them regardless of any class names. Okay, so margin bottom, and let's set it to 10 pixels or 20 so we can see it a little bit better. And so you see that in fact, the margin now got applied to all 3 of these paragraphs just as we wanted. Next up, we can also select the input and the button. So here we have the input and the button elements, and we can also style them a little bit too. So let me actually show you another cool thing. So we have the input selector, but now we want these rules that we're going to write here to apply to both the input and the button. And so we can write input, comma, button. And so this rule here will then apply to both of these selectors. So let's add a padding of 10 pixels and increase the font size, let's say to 16 pixel. So look at them now. And indeed, they got bigger and they got this nice padding in there now. And once more, you can see that these 2 elements, so input and button, are inline elements. So this one and this one, they both don't create a box that occupies the whole line. So again, just like the link. And I can actually show that to you by styling just this link. So let's say a background color and set it to yellow. And then here you see, and at least I hope you can see it. Well, let's actually set it to yellow-green. I think that's another Yes. And so now you can see it. And so the box now is only this element itself, but not the whole width of the screen. Okay. So actually, let's leave it like this so you can have this as a reference. And now to finish, I just want to show you one final but very important selector. And this one is actually pretty important for you to know because we're also going to use this all the time in JavaScript to select elements when we do DOM manipulation. Because in fact, all these selectors, the way they work in CSS, for example, the dot first, or here the ID selector, they're going to work just the same to select elements in JavaScript. And so that's one of the reasons why it's very important to learn how these selectors work. So anyway, the selector then I wanted to show you is the child selector. So the example I have here is that we have these two H2 headings. So this one and this one. But let's say I only wanted to select the H2 elements that are inside of this form here. Okay, so of course I could go ahead and add an ID or a class to this one. So here I could add an ID or a class, but I could also tell CSS to simply select this H1 that is inside of the element with the ID of your name. And so this is how it works. So again, we use the ID, your name. So just what we have here, and then a simple space, and then another selector. So in this case, that's simply the H2 selector, but it could be any other selector. So this here could also be a class selector or another ID selector, all right? But in this case, I just want to select the H2. And so let's change the color of this one, and let's change it to, I think there's one called olive. Or let's use this one, olive drab. And yeah, indeed. Now this one is green and this one is not, because this one is not inside the element with the ID of your name, right? And so this one here is very useful, and we use it all the time in CSS. And so that's why I wanted to show you this one here as well. Finally, just to make this a little bit smaller, let's also change the size of the image, because that's also something very important. So if we do not specify any sizes on the image, it will simply be as large as it can, okay? Or as large as the source image really is. But usually we don't want that. So on the image, it's pretty common to always set either a height or a width attribute. So let's do that here. So this one doesn't have, or maybe it does have a class. So, oh, actually it has an ID, okay? So we can, of course, use the image selector like I was just writing, but we can also use the ID. So the difference is that with the ID, if we had multiple images, then we would only select this one. So let's actually copy this one and use this. So ID, and then the name of the ID. And let's set the width here to 200 pixels. So what do you think will happen then to the height? Well, it's scaled proportionally. Okay, so that's very nice. Let's make it a bit bigger, 300 pixels. And so we don't have to worry about the height. We can still set it, but with that we will then change the aspect ratio. So if we set the height to also 300 pixels, it should then become a square. Yeah, that's right. Okay, and if we now turn off the width, so let's comment it out, then it will again scale proportionately. So the height is now 300, and then the width is calculated automatically. Let's set it back, and usually it's easier to simply specify the width. Okay, so that looks nice. Let's change the H1 a little bit to 35 to make it fit all in one line. And yeah, we have a nice little page here. It's not the best looking, but I think it taught you some things about HTML and CSS, at least the very fundamentals. So of course we only scratched the surface here, so probably this is less than like 5% of everything that there is to learn about CSS. So we didn't really talk about positioning, we didn't talk about Flexbox or CSS Grid, or many other important topics. But that wasn't also really the goal here. I just wanted to get you up to speed with the fundamentals of HTML and CSS so that you can understand a little bit of the code of the project that I included here in the course, and also so that you can learn how these selectors work, because as I mentioned, we will use them in JavaScript to select elements as well. So I hope you liked this small crash course, and I also hope I got you interested in HTML and CSS so that you now go ahead and research maybe a little bit more about it. Anyway, with that being said, let's now go straight into DOM manipulation in the next section, because that's really exciting and really cool.